Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Today we're going back to a thread of this war that doesn't get anywhere near the coverage it deserves. What thousands of organized Kurdish fighters across western Iran have actually managed to do to the Islamic Republic over the course of this conflict. This isn't a minor sideshow happening at the margins of the main story. It's been one of the most persistent internal security problems Tehran has faced this entire war, and I think once you trace the full arc of it, you start to understand just how much strain this front alone has put on a regime already fighting on multiple sides at once. Let's get into it. First, some context on who exactly we're talking about, because you can't understand what's happening now without understanding the history sitting underneath it. Iran's Kurdish population is concentrated primarily in the western provinces bordering Iraq, a region with its own distinct language, culture, and a long, documented history of organized resistance against Tehran that goes back decades before this current war ever started. That history isn't background trivia, it's the direct organizational and ideological foundation for everything that's happened since February. Multiple established Kurdish political and armed movements have operated out of this region and across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan for years, some tracing their roots back to uprisings in the earliest years of the Islamic Republic, when Kurdish autonomy demands were met with military crackdowns rather than negotiation. That founding grievance never really went away. It's been passed down through generations of Kurdish political organizing, periodic insurgent flare-ups, and a long history of Iranian cross-border strikes against Kurdish opposition figures and camps sitting just across the frontier in Iraq. So when this war broke out at the end of February, Kurdish opposition groups weren't improvising from a standing start. They were activating a mobilization structure that had already been building for months amid the broader wave of political instability and unrest that had been spreading across Iran through late 2025. Reports from that period described Kurdish parties coordinating general strikes that were widely observed across Kurdish-majority towns and cities, along with growing signs of quiet organizational consolidation among the various factions that had historically operated somewhat independently of one another. By the time the war actually started, several of the major Kurdish opposition groups had moved toward a more unified coordinating structure, aligning political messaging and, according to multiple reports at the time, beginning to coordinate military planning as well, positioning fighters along the border and reportedly inside Iranian territory itself, ready to respond as the broader conflict developed. The early response from Tehran was immediate and severe, which tells you something important about how seriously the regime was already taking this particular threat, even in the first days of a much larger war. Within the first week of fighting, Iranian strikes hit Kurdish opposition positions across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan, and within days after that, Iranian officials issued explicit warnings that any expansion of Kurdish militant activity operating out of Iraqi territory would be met with strikes against facilities across the entire Kurdistan region, not just against the specific groups involved. That's a notably broad threat, effectively holding the Kurdistan regional government responsible for the actions of independent armed groups it didn't fully control, and it put Erbil in a genuinely difficult position, caught between not wanting to be dragged into a war between Iran and the United States, while also not having full ability to prevent Kurdish opposition fighters from operating out of territory nominally under its jurisdiction. Then came a moment that briefly looked like it might reshape the entire trajectory of this front. Reporting in the early weeks of the war indicated the United States was seriously weighing direct support for armed opposition groups operating inside Iran. And when American officials were asked publicly about the possibility of a coordinated Kurdish offensive against regime positions in western Iran, the response was strikingly enthusiastic, rather than cautious or noncommittal. Multiple outlets reported that Washington had discussed providing meaningful air cover and other forms of backing, specifically to help Kurdish opposition forces take and hold territory in the western part of the country. Kurdish leaders who were part of those early conversations described being told, in fairly stark terms, that they needed to decide which side of this conflict they were actually on. A genuinely difficult framing for a population that has spent generations trying to navigate exactly this kind of impossible choice between larger regional and international powers. Kurdish leadership's own public response to that moment was notably measured rather than triumphant, and I think that measured tone tells you something important about how experienced these organizations actually are at reading these situations. Spokespeople for the major parties acknowledged the conversations were happening, confirmed that direct contact with American officials had occurred, but were consistently careful to note that no immediate large-scale ground offensive was actually being planned at that stage. Some of the individuals speaking publicly on this had deeply personal reasons for that caution, having personally survived earlier Iranian strikes against Kurdish leadership gatherings in years past, and having watched previous moments of apparent international interest in Kurdish causes fail to translate into sustained follow-through when the political winds shifted elsewhere. Researchers and analysts who tracked this specific region echoed that caution from the outside, arguing that Kurdish groups needed real, concrete guarantees, not just verbal enthusiasm, before committing fighters to any large offensive with more than one opposition figure making the same basic point in different words. The ground forces cannot move meaningfully without genuine assurance that the airspace above them will actually be cleared and held. That caution turned out to be well-founded, because the moment for a large, coordinated, American-backed offensive never actually arrived in the way it briefly seemed like it might. Through the spring, Kurdish groups remained relatively restrained, and the reasons for that restraint were fairly consistent across multiple reports from the period. There was genuine uncertainty among Kurdish leadership about whether the United States actually had a clear, sustained set of war objectives that would justify committing to a full offensive, as opposed to Kurdish forces potentially exposing themselves to a major Iranian counteroffensive, only to find external support wavering partway through, which is precisely the kind of abandonment Kurdish movements have experienced from outside powers multiple times across the past century. There was also real pressure from Turkey sitting in the background of all of this, given Ankara's own long-standing and deeply held concerns about any strengthened, independently operating Kurdish military capability developing anywhere in the region, a concern rooted in Turkey's own decades-long domestic conflict with Kurdish separatist movements. That combination of uncertain American follow-through and active regional pressure from Turkey closed the window that had briefly seemed to be opening in those first chaotic weeks of the war. Iran, for its part, wasn't sitting passively during this period either. Tehran moved to reinforce its western border regions, applied sustained diplomatic and security pressure on Baghdad to restrict the operating space available to Kurdish opposition groups working out of Iraqi territory, and reactivated loyalist Kurdish militia elements specifically organized to counter the independent anti-regime factions operating in the same region. Iranian strikes against Kurdish opposition camps and facilities across the border in Iraq continued at a genuinely brutal pace throughout this period, including at least one significant missile barrage in the spring that killed multiple fighters and wounded dozens more at a divisional headquarters, an attack Kurdistan regional government officials publicly condemned as a hostile violation of basic principles between neighboring territories. By the time a broader ceasefire framework was being discussed at the diplomatic level between Washington, Tehran, and the wider coalition later in the spring, Iraqi Kurdistan had already absorbed more than a dozen separate strikes, a clear signal that whatever pause was being negotiated at the top level of this conflict was never going to meaningfully extend to how Iran treated Kurdish opposition specifically. Now here's where this story shifts into something genuinely more significant than the cautious watch-and-wait posture that defined the earlier spring period. Starting in early summer, sustained, serious clashes broke out directly between organized Kurdish militant factions and Iran's Revolutionary Guard forces in the highland areas of western Iran, concentrated initially around specific mountain and border districts before spreading. Through the following weeks, these clashes intensified rather than fading, expanding geographically across a wider stretch of the Iran-Iraq border region and into multiple urban areas, and drawing in additional established factions beyond whichever group had initiated the initial engagements, meaning this wasn't an isolated flare-up involving a single organization, but a broader, coordinated escalation across the wider Kurdish opposition landscape. This period represented, by a wide margin, the most significant sustained ground confrontation between Kurdish opposition forces and the Iranian state in years, arguably going back further than that. Organizations that track security developments inside Iranian Kurdistan closely describe the fighting spreading across multiple population centers simultaneously, and multiple outlets covering the story at the time suggested this level of escalation carried real potential to develop into something resembling the larger historical uprisings that shaped this entire relationship in the first place. A genuinely notable development also emerged during this specific window that's worth dwelling on, because it tells you something important about the underlying dynamics driving this escalation. An entirely new militant organization, not one of the long-established parties with decades of institutional history, but a newly formed group emerging directly out of this specific period of unrest, claimed responsibility for an attack on regime-aligned local security personnel in a western Iranian town, and formally announced its own establishment shortly afterward, describing its goals in terms of strengthening Kurdish political identity and directly confronting the policies of the Islamic Republic. The emergence of a brand new organized group during this window, rather than simply an intensification of activity by the existing established parties, is genuinely significant. It suggests the broader mobilization happening across Kurdish areas was generating fresh organizational capacity on its own momentum, not just channeling existing capacity from groups that already had decades of institutional structure behind them. The fighting continued escalating through the following weeks. One particularly significant engagement near a border town saw one Kurdish faction reporting several of its own fighters killed in an ambush by Revolutionary Guard forces, while Iranian state media offered a competing account of the same engagement with different casualty figures on the Kurdish side. The kind of dueling narrative that's been a consistent feature of how this entire front gets reported, given how difficult independent verification is in that specific region. What stood out in the aftermath of that engagement, though, was that the Kurdish organization involved took the deliberate step of publicly naming each of the individual fighters killed, rather than simply citing an abstract casualty number. A detail that matters because it reflects how these organizations are choosing to communicate their losses to their own communities and to the wider diaspora watching from abroad. Analysts with deep, long-standing ties to Kurdish diaspora organizations offered a genuinely careful read on what this summer escalation actually represented, and I think their framing is worth sitting with, rather than rushing past. The consistent assessment from people who track this closely was that these clashes shouldn't be read as evidence of a full-scale, coordinated uprising on the scale of the historical rebellions, but that they equally shouldn't be dismissed as routine, low-level border friction of the kind that's flared up periodically for decades without escalating further. The framing that came up repeatedly in that period was some version of, this is not business as usual, this is a genuinely different tempo and scale than the periodic clashes this region has seen before. That's a useful way to think about it, more serious and more sustained than the sporadic historical pattern, but stopping short of the kind of decisive, coordinated offensive that had briefly seemed possible back when American backing appeared to be on the table in the war's opening weeks. It's worth spending a moment on why this particular escalation happened specifically in the early summer window, rather than during the more chaotic opening weeks of the war, when American interest in supporting a Kurdish offensive seemed most direct. I think the timing actually makes a lot of sense once you connect it to everything else happening in the broader conflict during that period. A formal diplomatic framework brought a pause to the main fighting between the United States, Israel, and Iran in the middle of the year. But that pause never meaningfully extended to how Iran treated Kurdish opposition specifically. Strikes on Kurdish positions across the border in Iraq continued right through that supposed lull. With international attention shifting elsewhere as the main conflict entered its diplomatic phase, and with Iran clearly continuing to treat Kurdish opposition as a serious, ongoing security priority regardless of the formal ceasefire status of the broader war, it's genuinely plausible that Kurdish leadership calculated this specific window, when Iran's broader military and political attention was theoretically less consumed by the main international confrontation, actually represented a more viable moment to escalate their own long-running resistance, even without the kind of dramatic, formal American commitment that had briefly been discussed months earlier. Let's talk honestly about what all of this actually adds up to, because I don't think either extreme framing does justice to what's actually happened here. On one hand, this clearly isn't nothing. Real fighters have died on both sides across sustained engagements spanning multiple months and multiple locations. Iran has had to divert genuine military and political resources toward managing this front throughout an already exhausting multi-front war, reinforcing border regions, reactivating loyalist militia forces specifically built to counter independent Kurdish groups, and continuing airstrikes against opposition positions across the border in Iraq, even during periods when the broader international conflict was formally paused. A brand new armed organization emerged directly out of this period of unrest, suggesting the underlying mobilization has real organic momentum beyond what any single outside power is directing or funding. That's a genuine, costly, ongoing internal security challenge for a regime that was already stretched thin managing a war on multiple other fronts simultaneously. On the other hand, it's important not to overstate what this has actually accomplished relative to the more dramatic framing that circulated in the war's opening weeks. This has not been the kind of decisive, coordinated territorial offensive that was briefly floated when American officials seemed most directly interested in supporting a large-scale Kurdish push into western Iran. No large stretch of Iranian territory has been seized and held by Kurdish opposition forces in the way that earlier, more optimistic framing suggested might happen. The full American air cover commitment that Kurdish leaders repeatedly said would be necessary before committing to a genuinely large-scale offensive never fully materialized at the scale being discussed in those early conversations, and Kurdish leadership's own caution about that gap between stated American interest and actual sustained commitment appears, in hindsight, to have been a genuinely accurate read of the situation they were actually operating in. I think the most accurate way to characterize what thousands of Kurdish fighters have actually done to Iran over the course of this war is this. They've sustained and meaningfully escalated a genuine ongoing insurgency across western Iran that has forced the regime to treat an entire internal front as a serious, continuous security priority throughout a period when Tehran was already fighting for its survival on multiple external fronts simultaneously. That's not regime collapse in the West. It's not the seizure of decisive new territory, but it's also not marginal or symbolic. It's a genuine, costly drain on Iranian military and political resources that has persisted and in some ways intensified, even during periods when the broader international conflict was theoretically winding down, and that persistence over months, rather than a single dramatic event, is really the story here. There's a broader strategic point worth drawing out from this too, because I think it connects to something we've discussed in other coverage about how this entire war has actually been fought and won on multiple different fronts simultaneously, rather than through any single decisive engagement. Iran has spent this entire conflict managing pressure on its naval capacity in the Gulf, pressure on its energy export infrastructure, pressure on its financial channels and shadow fleet operations, and running underneath almost all of that, sustained internal pressure from an organized, historically experienced Kurdish opposition movement that has never fully gone away, regardless of how many decades pass between major flare-ups. A regime fighting that many simultaneous fronts doesn't get to fully commit its attention or resources to any single one of them, and every division of attention and resources toward managing the Kurdish front, specifically, is attention and resources that couldn't be applied toward the naval, economic, or diplomatic fronts we've covered in more detail elsewhere. That's the real strategic value of this kind of sustained internal resistance, not necessarily decisive territorial change on its own, but a persistent drain that compounds alongside everything else a multi-front war is already demanding of an overstretched state. So where does this actually leave things going forward, and what's genuinely worth watching from here? I think the honest, open questions are these. Does this sustained but geographically contained insurgency eventually build enough momentum, particularly with new organizations continuing to emerge organically the way we saw happen this summer, to develop into something resembling the larger historical uprisings that originally defined this relationship between Tehran and its Kurdish population? Or does it remain constrained to this pattern we've documented? Real, costly, sustained resistance that never quite crosses the threshold into a fully coordinated, decisive offensive, particularly without the kind of concrete, sustained external air cover commitment that Kurdish leadership has consistently said would be necessary before committing to anything larger. And does the emergence of new, independently organized groups during this period suggest a genuinely new generation of Kurdish organizational capacity taking shape, one that might operate somewhat differently from the older, more established parties going forward, regardless of how the broader Iran conflict eventually concludes? None of those questions have clean, confident answers today. And I think it's more honest to leave them open than to force a tidier conclusion than the evidence actually supports. That's going to do it for this one. Let me know what you think down in the comments, whether you believe this ongoing Kurdish resistance eventually escalates into the kind of larger, decisive uprising some of the more optimistic early war reporting anticipated, or whether you think it remains constrained to this sustained but geographically limited insurgency pattern we've traced today. I always read the comments and genuinely enjoy seeing where everybody's thinking lands on this. If you want to stay on top of the day-to-day developments as this keeps unfolding, go ahead and follow along on our social channels as well. And if this is the kind of deep dive coverage you come here for, go check out the next video. It should be up right around now. Appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.